Hello once again everyone, and welcome back to HEMA Exercises. Sorry for the break in this series, had a bunch going on. But either way, today I want to talk about a concept that is going to be best represented with sword and buckler, but applies to everything, and that is the idea of framing. Now, framing can mean a couple different things, but in particular what I'm talking about when I say framing here is in regards to your movement between your center line and either an attacking stimulus line you're holding onto or your defense. So basically, what I'm talking about is with all of our swords, regardless of whether this be a symmetrical loaded stance or it be a linear forward stance, there is always the idea of I would like my core to be toward my opponent, and in general, I'd like all the actions to be happening in front of my core. This ensures that regardless of individual strength of arm, as long as I've got that, right, sometimes more or less so, I'm pretty strong against whatever's going to come against me. This also has the added benefit of creating space without you pushing your arms beyond yourself, which is why I wanted to talk about this with the sword and the buckler. So, with sword, we're always making angles, but bucklers are a little bit different. You all have heard the old adage of just stick it out there and it's doing its job for you. That is true, but there's more to it than that. Because once you stick the buckler out there, be this you're doing a guard, or be this it is just out there, right? Or even for that matter, if it's just hovering close to you, not withdrawn, what this is doing is it's really dividing my body into three openings. There is over the buckler, so toward my left, which is relatively difficult to get because there's not much worth taking there. There is between my weapons, the more ideal place that we generally want to go, and then there's over my sword, or my right opening. We're going to see a lot of work generally go there. In regards to the topic for tonight, let's talk about how I start adjusting my body depending upon that defense and what I want to avoid doing. So, we'll start first on my leftmost opening. Generally speaking, if anything should come to the left of my buckler in regards to an attack right now, I don't need to do all that much, right? My buckler is allowed to move a small bit to cover myself, as this is very non-committal, protects me quite a bit. We'll talk about a slightly better option in general, but right now, my hand slightly moving is not a problem. I don't need to put it out into space because, again, there's nothing over there. Even if I'm standing right forward, it's that same idea. I'm still quite covered by the buckler with just a little bit of tiny movement. The second place is in between my weapons. This is where things get a little more important. When a weapon comes in between, if you're doing any sort of two-weapon fighting, you are always going to run into the kind of difficulty of which thing do I use. In general, bringing them together is where you're going to get the most success. Now, together can mean two things. There is the weapons work in conjunction, and then there is the weapons are working as one. So I put a differentiation even though on paper that can mean the same thing. Essentially, if anything should come between my sword and my buckler, if I choose to use my buckler to close it off, the next thing that should be happening at the same tempo is my sword attacking. This should never be a one then the other. It should always be if I choose to use my purely defensive tool, then now the purely offensive tool must be doing something. The other form of this is where I bring them literally together, so that's where I use my sword. Now my buckler is becoming more an extension of my sword to protect myself, because I don't want to forget about this, just use my sword and then not have an offensive option. That's the reverse of what we talked about first. The third thing that can happen is someone goes over your sword side. This forces you to pretty much not get to use your buckler by running away from it, gets that sort of commitment where now I have to use my sword to protect myself, meaning that I don't have an offensive tool ready to go. The best instances are positions wherein when they go to that sword side, you can employ both weapons together to defeat against it. But all this is to say, essentially what you're looking to do here as the attacker is you're looking to get me to commit one of my weapons. Going between and over is really, or over to my right, is generally what you want to go for. I won't deny you can get people to move their buckler out to the left, or you can work that side by getting them to move their buckler up and down. See, for example, Lignesser's fifth play. All that aside though, if you get caught just moving your weapons, then your feet stop moving, and that is where we get to framing. So, for most sword and buckler stuff, framing is really more on the offensive side, right? So for example, a perfect example would be, I have bound against my opponent and they have pushed me to the side. I push my buckler up to hold them, and this frames my next cut around them. Essentially when the Schildschlacht, the buckler push, comes up, my movement is based around that central point, because if I just step pure forward, I push too much, or alternatively my opponent will be able to redirect me. But if instead I essentially get contact, however that contact may be, and move around it, then I'm able to be opposite of where my opponent's sword is. This is the same principle that you will see anytime you bind. You don't just bind and then go through. You try to get it as much into your enemy's right side as you can if you're both right-handed, and then you go through, creating that deeper wedge. Now, in the offensive category, most everyone figures that out pretty quick, but what hurts people is the defensive category. So, when something comes over my left side, and I'm tempted to move my buckler, if it's anything that just a little bit of turn, usually just the turn of my edge, can get, cool, nothing really needed. If it's anything deeper than that, like let's say for example, someone is going for that fifth play of Mingetzer, so a Stützhau is coming over my buckler. So for those of you that don't study, that is a tip going over my buckler. With that coming in, if I just raise my buckler, I make myself susceptible to more things, right? Not only just them continuing to go to my outside where my weapon cannot reach them, but also now I have lifted my buckler more than I wanted to. So what I will do in this situation is if I know I have to commit this a little more than just this, I will start turning and framing off of that point in space. Now this can be a couple different styles of footwork. There is the bit where you just keep yourself still loaded. This is generally if, again, you're going to be parrying with your weapon, now we're doing counterattack. Or there is the situation in which I can join them together, in which case now I also change my stance at the same time to get more pressure, and I will do a two-time attack. The idea is the same though. My arm has to move beyond the support of my core, move your core with it 1 degree, be that by changing feet or just by slightly changing the angle, and now I can support what would otherwise be too big of a movement. Let's look at that in a different scenario. This is the one that especially matters, things coming between your weapons. So, first example, something comes between and I want to parry with my buckler. Same exact idea as the last one. Something has come up between my weapons. If I'm going to use my buckler, I want to make sure that I'm framing off of it, so that way it's not just this, which now I can't do anything effective from, it's this, which loads me up and will make me able to do more attacks. Now, put a pin in that motion, because we'll get back to it again in a second. Same thing is also true if I choose to combine my weapons, so something is coming up between my weapons. This will be framing the other way though. So if I'm bringing things from my dominant hand in, I want to frame toward my right, so with the dominant hand. If something is coming up between and I'm using my buckler, then I frame toward my left, my non-dominant hand. In general, if you're going to be framing with your buckler, you want to try and get a little bit of backward motion. If you're doing the sword, you want to get a little bit of forward motion. But, I digress. Something now coming over my sword side, the framing is even more important. This is because, since it's not like this where I can really close off this middle line, the sword reaches a cap. I can push it out to the side, but any further than this, and I make the opening way too big. As such, you'll often want to keep this relatively narrow, but those of you that do sword and buckler fighting will know that narrow things are something you can plunge around, right? So, I parry, and now they can continue working that side. This is especially where framing is really going to matter, because if I commit my hand any further, I stay still and they're probably going to chop your legs if they don't get me with that thrust. This leads to the idea of deepening your defense. Anytime something comes in toward you, it's never just ha. It's never ha. It's always that idea of create a little bit of angle between you and whatever you're defending with, right? Regardless of side, and that's going to open up more opportunities and keep you more light on your feet. This is what leads to a lot of the actual fighting, I find, with sword and buckler in particular, but also just within this closer game, and this is also applicable to things like long swords, Winden, or wrestling, is its micro adjustments that really give you the advantage, not this big springy footwork. The time for that was you're on the offense and your opponent is not moving, or you're back out at distance. Now, I said to put a pin in something earlier, which was the idea of committing over by framing with your buckler. Something you always want to watch out for when you're framing is the ability for the opponent to cut the angle. And I talked about this in the open longsword playbook, so if you want to see more in depth about that, go watch that. But essentially, whenever you close one door, you open another, right? So if I close the middle door, I open more of the side over my buckler. Now this can be exploited in a couple different ways, but essentially the idea is, and if you want to do the footwork with me, this will make really good sense. You throw an attack up between my weapons. I frame off of that But rather than continuing this way, step around this way. What you'll notice is that using the camera's perspective, we will actually get physically closer. This is what is cutting the angle, wherein you cause me to move by causing the line of defense to change to one side, and then you step not back to your original position, but all the way across back to the other side of it, kind of an hourglass shape, which brings you closer to me, cutting the angle, and making me have to work double hard. Anytime you frame, you are opening yourself up to that, but it's not necessarily a problem, because staying in place is not a very good alternative. So instead, what you should make sure you're doing is you're not framing too much. If something comes in, I should only attest enough, generally a 45-degree line, that I am safe, and then if anything else comes in, at the bare minimum, I'll be able to frame back to where I was, if not, employ a larger motion to now go all the way back across. If, however, something comes in and I turn all the way to right angle, there's no way it's happening, right? Unless your opponent is really diving past you, but that's a kind of separate circumstance and has even better things for it. So for reference, let's go ahead and talk about that real quick. Another example of this, and I'm going to use single hand to exemplify it, but you do this with longsword, you do this with anything, you actually do this with a lot of weapons, is the idea of, okay, someone is actually diving past you. You don't want to be in front of them. You want to create some sort of shape, usually a hanging guard, that allows you to frame away from them as they go past, because instead committing your weapon or your body would bring you too far to the side, and generally you're going to get whacked on the way past. So that idea of something meets and I create some space and cut is the same sort of idea. Just now we're using this instead of the more obvious buckler. The same thing is also true if we're talking about, for example, something a little bit more narrow. And this is one that really gets people when they do linear style fighting, right? So this could be applicable to saber, backsword, rapier in particular. It is that idea of, okay, something's coming in on one of my lines, inside line, just for sake of funsies, because probably you're right-handed, right? If I start committing this too far, I make this opening even bigger. But let's say I need to. Let's say just going into quarto is not enough, right? There's still some stimulus coming in here. Rather than moving my arm over, adjust your body over. Now this still stays as a central line, meaning that if I need to, adjusting back down that line is not terribly difficult for me to do. Also, retreating from that line is quite easy. But now my hand is still supported by my core because this stance is just still this stance, one tick over. That micro adjustment will save you from ending up going back and forth with your arm a lot of the times and can be applied both offensively and defensively. But in particular, I draw attention to the defensive option because when someone is coming after you, it's very easy to get stuck trying to move your hand because you feel, yeah, they're going wide. They're trying to get you to do that, and it's hard not to fall into that trap. But just remember, keep your priorities in front of you. If you have to defend any wider, one, ask yourself if you actually do need to defend any wider, because the answer to everything is pretty much distance. But if you cannot, tick that one over, understanding you're opening another door, and if they should take it, you will have a better time closing off that line staying in the middle than if you had moved your hand out of position. And make sure not to frame too far, because then you're definitely not coming back in. So, all that is to say, next time that you're drilling by yourself with whatever your chosen weapon is, though I do find the buckler exemplifies this really, really well, or any offhand weapon really does, focus on keeping your core lined up in your defenses. It's not just strong parry, because strong parry doesn't necessarily mean all that mobile. It's that idea of creating this little bit of distance by using that hourglass principle. And sometimes that means moving more in place. Sometimes that means not changing your feet and instead sticking where you were, especially if you're doing something linear. I don't want to get caught left foot forward. I want to be comfortable being able to do these little adjustments however I need to, with whatever foot gets me where I need to go. But otherwise, thank you very, very much for watching. We'll go over some other techniques another time.